2004, Jane discovered how much time, planning, and preparation were necessary in order to consummate a transaction, achieve her goals, and ensure the continuity of her business. This experience fueled her desire to assist other business owners with their ownership transitions, whether they intend to transfer their business internally to management or family members or externally to an outside buyer. Jane is a CPA, a certified business exit consultant, a certified merger and acquisitions advisor, and a professional family business advisor. In 2010, she received the Excellence in Exit Planning Achievement Award from Pinnacle and Equity Solutions. She is the president of Business Transition Academy, Inc., and the co-author of Cashing Out of Your Business. So I'll hand it over to you, Jane, and can get started.
Great. Thanks so much, Precious. I appreciate the introduction. I hope everyone can see my screen. Precious, I just wanted to let you know for logistics, you and Laura Lee, that I am unable to see your chats while I'm presenting. So just text me if you need to reach me. And with that, we'll get started, everyone. Thanks so much for the introduction, Precious. I appreciate it. And thanks very much, Laura Lee, for inviting me to present this afternoon.
Sorry to interrupt, Jane. We could see your screen before, but it disappeared for some reason.
Oh, okay. Hang on one second. Let me see if I can. Here we go.
There we go.
Aha. How's that?
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for stopping me. I'm going to start again. Good afternoon, everyone, and so sorry about the technical difficulties. We're getting there. Good afternoon, and thank you again for the introduction, and thank you, Laura Lee, for inviting me to present this afternoon on this important topic. As Precious mentioned in the introduction, I was a business owner who grew a company with a few partners over the course of about 14 years before we sold the business. And we were approached by a couple of buyers in the early 2000s, and we ended up accepting an offer from the second buyer. But we really didn't plan in advance for the transition. And, you know, I was in a CEO forum for about 7 years, and it was wonderful, the best thing I ever did for growing the business. But I think we only had 2 speakers in 7 years on how to exit the business. So I didn't feel like I had a lot of knowledge on how to exit. And sure enough, we ran into some issues during the process because of the things that we didn't know. And we ended up hiring the wrong advisor to help us, who turned out to be unethical. And we had to fire the first one and then hire an attorney to help us get the deal done. Suffice it to say that we did get the deal done. It worked out pretty darn well, actually, despite the fact that we didn't know a lot about what we were doing at the time. But after working 3.5 years for the buyer, I decided to focus my practice on helping other business owners through this process because it's so critical. Most owners will only own one business in their lifetime. And during that, and they have to get it right. That means that their one exit has to be done right. So there's a lot at stake. And we're going to talk in a minute about what else is at stake. But with additional knowledge, owners will be much better prepared and they're much more likely to have a successful outcome. So today we're going to cover a number of things. So let's quickly look at the agenda. We're going to talk about what is at stake. We are going to talk about the lack of planning that's in the marketplace. And really, we really should call it the lack of information. But because of that lack of information, owners have not historically planned for these very important transactions. Owner challenges and concerns. So owners have a lot of common challenges and concerns when they're faced with a decision about how best to transfer the ownership of their business to somebody else. So we're going to talk about several of those. We're going to talk about the Business Transition Academy just for a moment and the 6-step planning process that we outline in the book. And we're going to go through that 6-step planning process in some detail just to describe what each of the steps is so that you can understand what you have to do in order to plan for this very important transition. We're going to talk about the top 10 benefits of doing this type of planning in advance. We're going to talk about which strategies owners choose and why. And it's not just the owners in my client base, but also nationwide and market-wide. What are the strategies that owners are choosing? And I think you'll be a little bit surprised, because I was. And why are they choosing them? What are the pros and cons of those different strategies? We'll talk about lessons learned, the all-important lessons learned. I've personally now worked with almost 100 different owners during the last decade, 100 different transitions. And there's a lot of lessons that I see that owners have learned along the way. Things that if they had known more, if they had only had more information earlier, things that they could have avoided, things they could have done better, mistakes they made in running their business and not preparing. So we'll talk about these very important lessons learned, because I think that's a really great way for other business owners to not make the same mistake. I have to say, being in the CEO forum that I was in, and all of you who are in Interrise, listening to other business owners, it's wonderful because you can avoid mistakes that they've made. So it's great to be in the group forum that you're in. So we'll talk about lessons learned, and then we'll talk a little bit about how you can get additional information. So let's talk about what's at stake. Many years ago, there was a book called The $10 Trillion Opportunity. And that was the number that was assigned to the amount of owner wealth that had to be transferred in this country. So it's approximately $10 trillion of net worth that they estimated that had to transfer from one owner to the other. And that's because the baby boomer generation, of which I am part of, I'm on the younger side of the baby boomers, but there's millions of baby boomers that own businesses that have to transfer the ownership at some point. And the estimate was $10 trillion of net worth will transfer. Those businesses encompass about 50% of the jobs in the United States. So it's privately held businesses in this country employ more than 50% of the workers. The publicly held companies employ the balance, but most people think of the huge public companies as being the largest employer, but it's actually the private companies. So there's a lot of jobs at stake here. The owner's personal wealth and quality of life is absolutely at stake. As I mentioned, if owners have one shot at getting this right, most owners are highly dependent on the proceeds from their business ownership transition in order to fund the rest of their lives. So it's really important that they get it right. And so their personal wealth is at stake. If they don't get enough money from the transition, they will have to have other sources of income. If they plan in advance, they're much more likely to get enough money for their financial independence during the ownership transfer. Quality of life. Of course, everybody's budget affects their quality of life. But it also speaks to the goals that owners have. And part of our process is to outline the owner's goals so that they can have the type of life that they want to have in the next phase. And relationships. Relationships are at stake. There are so many relationships, and in just a minute, we're going to talk about the different types of relationships that business owners have. But suffice it to say that it's very important for owners in our work with them and just knowing the priorities that owners have. They want to preserve their relationships. They have relationships. There's a lot of stakeholders here, and we're going to talk about those in just a minute. Okay, the lack of planning. So this was based on a 2013 survey conducted by EPI in partnership with Grant Thornton, PNC Bank, and the Ohio Employee Ownership Center of Kent State University. That's a mouthful. If anybody wants that that information, I would be happy to send it to them. But in that 2013 survey, they discovered, and this was based on the interviews with thousands of business owners, that 86% of those owners had not developed a written strategic or business value enhancement plan. So they don't have a written business plan, essentially, not even a written business plan. 83% of owners have no written transition plan. So despite the fact that they were talking to owners who were older, who were of baby boomer age and needing to get out, I believe that was the focus of the survey, 83% of them have no written transition plan. And part of that is because where do you find a template, right? So we've developed a template that owners can use for a transition plan. 49% of those owners had done no planning at all. And 49% had no plans, and this really bothers me, had no plans that cover illness, death, or forced exit from the business. And we're going to talk in just a minute about contingency planning and some real cases in my client base of folks that wish they had done more planning. So no plans that cover illness, death, or forced exit. Let me just say it now, and I'm going to say it again. All owners, regardless of age, must have a contingency plan. Accidents happen, illnesses happen, and you've got to have a plan. You've got to have a plan. Okay. Let's talk a bit about challenges and concerns. So when we work with owners, we always ask them about what do they feel are the barriers for doing an ownership transfer. And by the way, when we talk about ownership transfer, we're talking about either internal transfer to family members or key managers, key employees, or external transfers to outside buyers. And we're going to talk in a few minutes about the different types of transfers that are available to owners and what types of buyers there are for the company. But when owners are faced with these transitions, they have a fear of conflict. I have to say that is the number one concern that I hear from owners is the fear of conflict. They don't want this to cause conflict. They want to be sure that that when they're going through this process, they can preserve the very important relationships that they have. Family dynamics. I have been involved in a couple of different family businesses. My husband has been for almost 40 years now, family business. So we know how challenging it is to run a business and to be involved in a business. And then when you layer the family on top and those relationships, it adds what I call a layer of complexity to any business. So it's already complex to run a business, and then you have the family dynamics, which adds a layer of complexity. So we always want to keep those in mind and need to keep them in mind. I was on the phone this morning with an owner who has a non-family member, COO, who's been running the company very effectively for a number of years, and he has a son who's only 22 years old who is in the business. So he needs to figure out, and he's ready to transition out. And of course, the son is not ready to run the business. So it's tricky because he has a non-family member COO who is ready to run the company and a son who's not. And actually, that's the second situation where I've had that, a non-family member who is the more experienced one. So it presents some challenges, and they must be, taken into account, is preserving those family relationships. The owner's feeling of self-worth, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. Many owners identify their entire sense of self-worth as being the CEO of the company. So what happens to that self-worth when they're no longer the CEO? What's the plan for the owner? And we'll talk about how we address that in the planning process. Employees. I'll tell you, when we talk to owners, you'll often hear that owners are very concerned with preserving their legacy. Well, what we found is that legacy is not the owner's name on the door. It's not the owner's reputation in the community, but it's the owners are saying, I really want to preserve this for my employees. They're more focused on the employees and the business continuity as the legacy than they are their own name. So making sure that the employees, they have a lot of families dependent on those paychecks, and they're very interested in making sure that the employees are taken care of. Co-owners. We have lots of situations where there are multiple owners. As I mentioned in my introduction, I had 3 partners in the business that I sold most recently in 2004. I've had partners now on multiple occasions. So I call them partners generically, but co-owners is what I mean. So, and sometimes it's the younger co-owners that want to leave before the older ones. I've had that situation as well. So anytime you have co-owners, you may be going through a transition because one or more owners might want to leave. So everybody has different goals. They may have different timelines. So in many of our cases, we're working with co-owners, and then in addition to that, bringing in future owners to the puzzle as well. So it can get complicated, but there are ways to make sure that you're handling it well. Personal financial independence I spoke about just a moment ago. And that is the ability for the owner to get as much money as they need in order to meet their own personal financial goals in their next phase of life. So that's always a concern for owners, of course, so that they can maintain their lifestyle. and health. You know, many owners, and it's very easy for us to work too much and to lose the balance in our lives. And many owners, if they haven't reclaimed their health while they're working, they certainly want to reclaim it after they are not working so much. So that's a very common concern for owners as well. And of course, as we get into the baby boomer years, we tend to have more health issues as we get older as well. So that's always a concern. Okay, so lots of challenges and things to talk about. And as we go along in our 6-step process, I will discuss those in a bit more detail and how some of this planning can help to mitigate those barriers and concerns. Just very, very quickly about the Business Transition Academy. As I said, my goal was to create an educational portal for owners so that they could get the information they need in order to create an effective ownership transition plan. So our mission at BTA is to educate owners so they may create their own business ownership transition plan. And in order to accomplish that, we have a resource center on the website that we encourage you to check out. Lots of tremendous number of articles and blogs and white papers, case studies, lessons learned, transition mentors like myself who actually work with clients, and also training courses. And actually in the past, we had taught some live owner workshops. And what we're getting prepared to launch this fall will be some webinar training. So we look forward to being able to announce that within the next month or two. And really just taking what we used to teach live and putting it in the form of webinars so that owners can watch those on their own schedule and get up to date on all the information that's out there on ownership transfers. So that's what we're up to at the Business Transition Academy. Back in 2014, I believe it was, 13 or 14, we published a book called Cashing Out of Your Business, Your Last Great Deal. And in that book, it provides an introduction to business ownership transition planning and why it's necessary for owners to plan well in advance. This book is on our website if anybody's interested. There's a free chapter out there. But really, our goal was to just get the word out. Get the word out on the things that owners need to know before they have an ownership transfer. And this all came out of my experience of not having this information before I transferred. So I wanted to be sure, Kathy and I wanted to be sure that we got this information out there for other owners so that they would have the advantage of being able to plan in advance. Okay, in that book, we define a business ownership transition plan. So here you can see it's coming across the screen. So a business ownership transition plan is a comprehensive written document that outlines how and when the ownership of a business will be transferred to others, either internally or externally, in order to achieve the owner's goals. So it's very simple. It's a written document. You saw in that slide that we looked at, that was the survey of the business owners, how few owners actually had a written transition plan. But I think a lot of that is because they really don't have a template. But there was also a note about owners not having a written business or value enhancement plan. And of course, we can all look at the studies that show that written plans are much more likely to come true than those that aren't written, that are just in the owner's heads. So we encourage people to actually write it down. So that's our definition of a business ownership transition plan, or a BOTP. Now let's take a look at the steps that you have to go through as an owner in order to put together that BOTP, or that business ownership transition plan. So again, this is on our website and in the book, but we outline six simple steps that owners can follow in order to plan for their ownership transition. I'm going to just really just say the names of those here, and then we're going to talk about each one just for a few moments. So step 1 is getting yourself prepared. That's all about the owner. Step 2 is counting beans. That's all about the current owner's financial situation and how much money they need from the transition. Step 3, we call building a better box. And that's all about the company. How can we make the company better? How can we maximize the value? And because that's the ticket for owners to get financial independence. What is their business worth today, and how can they maximize the value? Step 4 is follow the yellow brick road, and that's all about the business owner's options. both internal as well as external. And we'll talk about a number of those in just a minute. Step 5 is called the art of the deal, and that's all about how you go about selling the business. And it's not just the external sale. Although in our book we do talk about, we have a section called the top 10 deal killers. So I would encourage you, if you're going to sell your business externally, to look at that chapter. And it's all about very common mistakes that owners made if they're selling their business externally. But we also talk about taxes and advisory fees, and all owners, regardless of the type of transition that they're going to have, will pay taxes and advisory fees. Sometimes those fees take a big bite out of the proceeds, so it's important for owners to understand how those work. And step 6 is called paint by numbers, and that's really pulling together all the information that you've analyzed and created in the prior 5 steps into a written plan. So step 6 is actually now documenting your plan and making a decision about which strategy you want to partake for your transition or your exit. You notice I don't call it the word, I don't use the word exit very often when we talk about transitioning the ownership. And that the reason we don't do that is because many owners don't want to exit. They actually want to stay involved in their company for quite some time. So it's really important for you to know that when I say exit, it could be transition, but it doesn't necessarily mean that owners have to leave the business. They may not exit for several years. So let's talk about each one of the steps in the process now, just for a moment. Getting yourself prepared. I talked a moment ago about how owners really begin to see themselves as one with the business. So we call this our first and most important step, is preparing yourself for the transition. Now, some owners won't leave for several years. Others will want to leave right away. So it's important for owners to understand their desired timeline for their transition and to prepare themselves for what comes after. Because if they're no longer going to be the CEO, then what are they going to do so that they have feelings of self-worth and that they're contributing? So in getting yourself prepared, we're asking the owners to really outline their goals and their vision for the transition, and also what their life after the transition looks like. We just note here that owners' identities are very, very much tied to the business. So I only had that business that we sold for 14 years, and my identity was very much associated with being the CEO of that business. And that's because I spent the majority of my time as CEO. So what was it that I was going to do after? It took me several months to figure out what I was going to do when I finally left the buyer some 3.5 years later. Owners have to consider both financial as well as non-financial goals. Financial is very important, and you're going to see that throughout our process, we certainly look at the financial aspect, but we also look at a lot of non-financial aspects. We look at pros and cons. We look at owners' goals. So it's important to consider both the financial as well as the non-financial, and not just chase the money, right? It's not all about just the money. You want to be happy after you go through this transition as well. Consider each of the multiple facets of your life as you architect your plan. And what we mean there is that all owners have a multifaceted life, right? But work, your life may be a bit out of balance right now, where maybe work is consuming 60 or 75% of your time. For some owners, it could be less. But you also may have philanthropic work, you have family time, right? You have, there's all kinds of religious community. There's a lot of different ways that we could spend our time. And most owners that I work with and that we work with want to get more balance back in their lives. So they need to consider all facets of their life and where they want to spend their time after the transition. Identifying fears, concerns, and other barriers and address them early. We talked about some common fears and barriers earlier. And in this process, this is where we identify those fears, concerns, and barriers so that we can keep them in mind throughout the planning process and try to address them as we go along. I mentioned earlier that owners have a lot of stakeholders in the business. They have, of course, the owner, right? And then the owner's family, and then the business family, right? You've got the managers and the employees of the business. So, and of course, as we discussed earlier, if it's a family business, then you've got multiple stakeholders in the business that are also related to the owners. But you also have family members that are not involved in the business, and that can also add a layer of complexity. I have a classmate, an old classmate, who I actually went to high school with, who was one of 5 children, and her father left the business to them, and the only one or two of them were ever involved in the business. And there was a lot of contention between the siblings that were involved and those that weren't. So it can still add stress to the uninvolved family members as well, and it has to be planned for very carefully. So the goal with this planning is to try to address all these different stakeholders, right, and to make sure that throughout the planning we're addressing those and trying to preserve those relationships as best we can. Okay, so that was step number 1. Step number 2 is called counting beans. And in step number 2, we talk about the wealth gap. And here's the definition of a wealth gap. It's the difference between what you have today, what you have saved, or what your net worth is today without the business, your net worth without the business, right? What you've saved outside the company, less what you need in order to produce the gross annual income that you'll need post-transition. So how much do you need in your portfolio after the transition to produce enough annual income so that you can achieve your goals and live the lifestyle that you would like to? And the difference between those two is the wealth gap, or the money that you need to net from your business transition. So it's the money you need from your business transition, or what we call the wealth gap. So that's the definition of the wealth gap. How much do you need from the company? And we ask a very important question here for owners. And actually, we talk about this in depth in the book as well. And that's, are you diversified as an owner? The vast majority of business owners have a lot of their net worth tied up inside their business. Some owners have almost all of their net worth tied up inside their businesses. Others have a minority of their net worth. We always encourage owners not to have their eggs or their beans in one basket. We want them to be diversified. Does your personal spending match the business profit? So one way that owners can get out of balance, shall we say, is by ratcheting up their spending to match the business profits, right? So, and then when the business profits go down, it's really hard to ratchet down your spending. Once you've got, memberships and private school tuition and a lot of other things, multiple houses, homes, it can be very difficult to ratchet down those expenses quickly. So owners have to be careful that they're not ratcheting up their spending to match the business profits. How dependent are you on the transition proceeds? So what the wealth gap does is it measures how dependent owners are on the wealth gap proceeds. And we just ask here, how much have you saved outside your business? So I want you to ask yourself this question: how much have I saved outside my business? And just to let you know that it's critical that you're saving outside the business. Absolutely critical. It will reduce your dependence on the transition, which is exactly the position you want to be in. So we encourage all owners to be diversified. We talk here about contingency planning, and a moment ago I talked about it, and I promised you I was going to say it again. All owners, regardless of age, need a contingency plan because you never know what can happen. There are 2 client cases just in my client base. One where I was called in to help the widow of a business owner who passed away suddenly in his mid-40s, just out of the blue, had not done any planning. He had about 2.5 weeks to get his affairs in order, and he did get to an attorney, but there just wasn't enough time to get a plan in place for his employees to buy the business. So about 1.5 years later, I got a call from his widow, who was still struggling and in shock about her husband's death. And they tried, she needed some assistance to try to get the business sold to the employees. Well, we got it done. It took quite a bit of time. But just suffice it to say that she had to go through a lot a lot to get this done. So if the planning had been done in advance, it would have been much, much easier on his family. Another situation just recently with a client who did a full transition plan, including a contingency plan. He stepped away from his business about 2 years ago, and he died of ALS just about at the 2-year mark last November. Terribly sad, sad situation. One of the most wonderful people I've ever met, I could say, in my lifetime. But his plan was completely done, and everybody knew what was going to happen if he passed away. So he had actually transitioned out of the business. He was still getting paid, and still he will, his wife ended up selling the rest of his shares after he passed away. But there was a plan to do so, and it was funded by life insurance. So all owners, regardless of age, need a contingency plan. I promise I won't say it again today. Building a better box. Okay, so step number 3 in our process, how businesses are valued. Business valuation is a prophecy of future cash flows, right? So whether you have an external or an internal buyer, there must be cash flows in the business in order for the business to have value. Buyers don't want to buy businesses that don't generate cash, right? Everybody wants a return on their investment, and they won't get a return unless there's cash coming out of the business. So in rare instances, you will have companies that are sold based on simply gross revenue. Software companies come to mind. So they don't necessarily have to have profits, but their selling price can be based on gross revenue. But that is the rare scenario. Most business valuations are based on profits, and that your business must have cash flow in order for it to have value. Publicly held companies have a definitive value on any given day based on their stock price. But privately held companies don't. There is no market for privately held company stock. So the way we talk about value for privately held companies is as a range of values. And it's a range because on any given day, it's substantially driven by the type of buyer or the purpose of the valuation. So we could talk for hours about business valuation, but I want you to know some very important things. One is, if you get your business valued, one of the most important things that the valuation appraiser is going to ask you is why would you like me to do a valuation? What is the reason that you're having me do a valuation? And so that the valuation of your business will be different depending on why you're trying to value it. If it's for divorce or for tax purposes or for an employee stock ownership plan, they will use one standard of value to measure your company. If it's to the outside buyer on the open market, that will be a totally different value. If the bank is valuing your business for liquidation purposes or asset purposes, that will be yet a different value. So there's a range of values on any given day, and it's substantially driven by the size of the company, the amount of cash flow, your industry, and the type of buyer that's looking at your business. Who can provide business valuations? There are certified business valuations where you can literally pay sometimes $15,000, $10,000 to $15,000 for a certified business valuation. You would have to get a certified valuation for gifting, estate planning, implementing employee stock ownership plans, sometimes shareholder agreements, divorces, things of that nature. You're going to need a certified business valuation. For most other purposes, owners don't need certified business valuation. They can get by with a ballpark range of values. So a ballpark range of values. And there's a number of different folks that can calculate these different types of valuations. But for a ballpark range of values, especially if you're planning for an exit and you're just wondering roughly what is my business worth today, why not get just a ballpark range of values today, or a calculation done, and then work on, and then you'll know how much do I have to grow the business in order to transition. Because in one of our future steps, as you might recall, we talked about your wealth gap, right? So your wealth gap is how much money you need from the transition. In step 3, we talk about what your business is worth. And in step 5, we talk about taxes and fees, so you'll understand how much you can net from the business sale. So will the amount that you net meet that wealth gap? That's what we're trying to figure out. So getting a ballpark range of values may be just fine now, so that you can understand roughly what your business is worth today, and then figure out how much it needs to grow in the future in order to bridge your gap. So let's talk about what we consider the top 8 drivers of business value. And there are many drivers of business value, but here are 8 important ones. Increasing revenue and profits. Buyers do not want to buy a business that has no growth potential, right? So they want increasing revenue and profits. They want to see that nice line that goes up to the right that's increasing. And they want the company to also have growth potential, right? So if you've tapped out the business, they're not going to be interested in it. Clean financials. Let's talk about that one. As business owners, everybody puts expenses through the company that are personal, right? That they may or may not document, right? So having a clean set of financials, we're not saying that all owners have to stop putting all expenses through the business. But what we are saying is that you have to keep them to a minimum, document them, so that you could get an add back if you were to talk to a buyer about those personal expenses, so that you can prove they were personal, right? And to make sure that you're having a CPA look at your financials at least once a year. Now, as you probably know, CPAs can provide audits, they can provide reviews, or they can actually put together your financials, which is called a compilation. Now, you don't have to have the CPA do this, but if you have the CPA do an audit, that will be the highest form of credibility that can be assigned to your financials. But small companies don't often pay for audits. So having even a review is helpful, so that if you are planning to sell, especially externally, having a review goes a long way toward building credibility in your financials. Okay, solid management team. Believe it or not, buyers they don't want the business dependent on the owner or the owners. They want a solid management team, right? So that if in case the owners leave after the sale, which is very common in an external sale, that owners leave pretty quickly, that there's a solid management team left behind to run the company. So they always want to see a solid team. Quality products and services, that goes without saying, right? You obviously need good quality products and services. Strong sales and marketing, right? Strong sales and marketing. So sometimes owners are really good and their businesses are set up to be really good at sales and marketing. Other times, owners have been able to simply generate revenue and profits without putting a lot of effort into sales and marketing. So if you're one of those companies, I really encourage you to beef that up in your business. And also, even if you are good at sales and marketing, take a look at what you're doing and make sure that it's strong and very well presented to an outside buyer. Low risk. Again, we could talk for hours about low risk here. There are so many risks in businesses, not the least of which today is cyber or technology. We have employee risk, right? If you have too many of your sales going to one customer, that's called customer concentration. If you have too many of your parts coming from too few vendors, it's called vendor concentration. There's all kinds of risk, and one way to mitigate that is by having the proper insurance. We don't have time right now to talk about a case in my client base of a company who twice now, they didn't have a lawsuit in their first 35 years of operating, and they're going through their second one now in the last few years. So daunting to have those lawsuits, and very, very expensive. So please look at your business and really make sure, look at your insurance every single year and make sure you're properly covered. Make sure you're out there getting quotes and you've talked to a number of different companies. Systems and processes in place, that's a given. Buyers want to see that you've got a system and processes in place to run your business. You've systematized the business so that it's repeatable. All they care about is it repeatable? Can they repeat the same kind of performance that you had if they buy the company? Okay, step number 4 is called follow the yellow brick road. So in step number 4, we're talking about the different transition options. So first of all, we talk about internal transition options, so transfer to an internal buyer. And there's different types of transfers. There's employee stock ownership plans. There are gifts or sales to family members or to non-family member and family member. And then we have co-owner or management, quote unquote, buyouts. Sometimes it's a buy-in. It's not necessarily a buyout. There may be outside management, but what we're really talking about here is inside management or co-owners buying out transitioning owner shares. So there's a number of different internal transfers. We could talk for a number of hours about each of these. The employee stock ownership plan is a really interesting one. But you have to be a certain size. In order to think about doing an employee stock ownership plan, you really need to have at least $3 million in business value, $500,000 a year in profits or cash flow, and at least 20 employees to be large enough. So very small companies really can't do an employee stock ownership plan. It is a form of retirement plan, just like a 401k. So it's and there's a lot of oversight. There's a lot of audits. It's very expensive to set up. So for the right company, it's a great solution because there's a lot of great tax benefits as well. When we talk about gifts or sales to family, there's a number of different ways that those can be structured. And one of the common things that I hear from owners is that my family or my managers don't have any capital to put into the business. That's okay if there's enough cash flow in the business, right? So we can use profits of the business in order to fund these if we have to. There's also bank debt that can be leveraged. And, you know, a lot of owners want their managers or family members to put in capital that's in proportion to their net worth, right? So at least put some skin in the game in order to figure out who wants to step up to the plate to be an owner. So those are some different types of internal transfers. Let's look at some different types of external. Or different types of buyers is what we're really looking at here. So there are synergistic buyers. And what we mean by that is there are buyers out there that could buy your company that could achieve a 1 + 1 = 3, which means they will generate more profits with your business than you did, simply by combining their business with yours, right? So it's a 1 + 1 = 3. They can either cut overhead because you're in a similar business. They can cut the number of locations. They can cut corporate employees, either HR or accounting. Those are just examples. So synergistic buyers are able to achieve more profits with their business than you have been able to. A financial buyer, on the other hand, cannot. And a financial buyer, by definition, is a buyer that's going to come in that needs your overhead, right? That's going to offer you a decent value for the company, but not the highest. The synergistic buyers can afford to offer you the highest. Examples of financial buyers could be retired executives. It could be small private equity firms, small to large ones for that matter, private equity firms. And here we talk about private equity groups. They are a bit of a different animal. Most private equity transitions, they are a form of financial buyer, but most private equity groups or firms will buy only a portion of your business. They would expect you to maintain the rest of the ownership. So typically they may you may sell 75 or 80% to that private equity group, and the current owner will maintain the rest until the business is sold again. So it can be complicated, but I'll tell you, it can work well. I have had clients sell to private equity groups. They're looking for businesses that have very high growth potential in certain industries. So it's not for everyone. And they wouldn't necessarily be interested in every business, but it can work out well in the right situation. Okay, so all these choices, right? So we're talking about what are the different options for owners. As you begin to think about, do I want to transfer internally or externally, you have to think about the benefits and the risks of each option related to all of these things. Your goals and objectives, right? How does each transfer strategy fit in with your goals and objectives? Your financial liquidity, in other words, which ones will provide you with the money that you need? Your costs, right? Because each one of these has certain costs associated with it. Your desired involvement. As I said, some owners want to leave right away and others want to stay for years. So which options allow you to achieve your goals for involvement? The impact on the business and your employees. So very, very importantly, what's the impact of each one of these options on the business and your employees? And the timing of your transition, right? So if you are looking, if a buyer comes knocking on your door today and you're not ready, you really didn't want to leave, does that strategy fit you well, or are you better off waiting, right? So the timing of your transition. Okay, so there's a lot of things to think about when we talk about follow the yellow brick road, lots of different options. Now let's look at the art of the deal, because this is also very, very important. We don't expect our owners to become tax experts. It's not their role, it's not their job. However, what I do recommend is that owners get some knowledge. They have to have a basic level of knowledge about taxes, right, which is good for just running your business, but also about taxes related to a business transfer, right? You have to understand how your transaction will be taxed. There are story upon story. There are stories in the marketplace about business owners who didn't understand the tax ramifications of their the tax ramifications of their sale, right? So that they were really in trouble when it came time to do the transition, or they had incredible seller's remorse, right? Because they just didn't get enough money. So let's talk a little bit about business transfer basics. The gross proceeds, right? If you sell your business, the gross proceeds less the transaction fees minus any corporate income taxes that might be owed, minus any personal income taxes that might be owed, are your net proceeds. So that's what we mean by taxing on a business transfer, right? So depending on, here's the very important point, depending on the type of entity that you are as a business, whether you are a C corporation, an S corporation, a partnership, a sole proprietorship, each one of those is taxed differently if you sell your business. Some of those, like for example, a C corporation asset sale will be double taxed. You'll have corporation tax and you'll also have personal income tax. So it really depends on the entity type that you've got, along with whether you're selling the assets or the stock, right? So that's a very important point as well, the assets or the stock. So if you sell the assets of the company, it will be taxed one way. If you sell the stock, it will be taxed another way, typically at lower rates. But that's not always the case. So the taxes can be complex, and we encourage owners to work with their CPA to understand not only their income tax, but also how their transfer would be taxed as well. So remember that the ultimate question we're trying to answer is, when we think about all these options, can you afford the option that you most want to pursue in your desired time frame? So as the owner, can you afford the option that you most want to pursue in your desired time frame, right? That's what we're trying to answer. So we're calculating the net proceeds in Art of the Deal so that you can match it up to your wealth gap and figure out, can you actually afford each one of these options? And just know that each one of the transfer options would have a different net proceed. It would have a different net proceed. So a very important point. This is all these things that I didn't know when I had a buyer approach my business. Okay, paint by numbers. So this is how we pull it all together into a written plan, right? So the creation of a business ownership transition plan. So we review everything that we've done in each of the steps. So step number 1 was called getting yourself prepared. That's all about the owner's goals and their vision for the transfer, right? And also their concerns and barriers. Their financial needs is all defined in counting beans. So owner's financial needs, right? So how much do I need? What is my wealth gap, which is what we defined in step number 2. In step number 3, called building a better box, it's all about the business and determining what the business is worth, right? What is the business worth? In step number 4, follow the yellow brick road, it's all about the transfer options, internal versus external. What will different buyers pay for your company? And oh, by the way, I just wanted to mention while we're at this step that just because you have an internal transfer doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be giving up a lot of value on the price of your business. Doesn't necessarily mean that you'll make less. So it depends on the profits of the business and how it's structured. In some of the cases that I've worked on, owners will actually be able to net more money from an internal transfer than they could an external sale. And you may say, well, how can that be? And the answer is because they're driving the value, right? They're determining the value for the internal transfer. If you're selling externally, an outside buyer is telling you how much they're going to give you. With an internal transfer, owners have a lot of control over how much money they take out of the business. And I might add that it can sometimes be much more tax efficient to do an internal transfer. Okay, in step number 5, called Art of the Deal, we talked about taxes and deal considerations. And here we are in step number 6. So in Paint by Numbers, we're pulling all of this information together into a written plan, and then owners are using that information to make decisions about which strategy or strategies they can afford to research, right, or go down the path and actually execute. Which strategies can they afford, right? Which ones do they want to do? So, but in order to determine which strategy is right for you, we believe that you need to take these steps. We can't cut out any of these steps before we would make a decision about which path to pursue. All of them are important. Okay, so let's transition for a minute. So that's the 6-step process that we talk about in the book and also on the website. And those are the steps that you can take to put together your own business ownership transition plan. But let's shift gears for a minute and just remember and remind ourselves what the benefits are of planning in advance. So planning in advance will allow owners to positively affect their outcome, right? If you plan in advance, you can positively affect the outcome. How? You can ensure that the owner's goals are met, right? You're much more likely to achieve your goals if you figured out what they are and then built that into the plan. You can determine how much the business may need to grow, and I talked about that a minute ago. If you knew the numbers, if you only knew the numbers before you sold, right, you could have grown the business before you sold it, knowing that you needed another $1 million out of the sale. If somebody had only told you what the business had to be worth before you sold it, you could have done it, right, or you would have done it. So why not have a business growth plan that's tied to what it needs to be in order to achieve your goals? You can, and that's where we're talking about maximizing the business value, right? If you have time, that's not a switch that you flip and all of a sudden your business is worth more tomorrow. There's a few things you can do overnight to improve the value, but most of them will take time. Groom others to assume leadership positions. How many years does it take to groom somebody to be able to run a business? Depending on the type of business and how capable they are, it can take years. It really can take years to develop them. So if you do this in advance, you've got time to groom the leadership to take over the business. Protect the business and the personal wealth. So this planning in advance will go a long way toward being able to protect that business and personal wealth, right? All owners have at least some of their net worth tied up inside the business. Nobody wants to lose that. Determine which options are possible and the best fit. Without doing this analysis, how do you know which options are possible and which are the best fit for your goals? React appropriately to unsolicited offers. That happened to us. We were approached by a couple of buyers and we didn't know how to react. So if you plan in advance, you'll be ready and you'll know what to do when somebody comes knocking on the door. All of that's part of the training that we do in Art of the Deal. Number 8, act when the time is right for going to market. Right now, we are in a historical, this will go down in history as one of the best decades to sell your business. The last 4 decades have lined up one on top of the other as far as when it was a good time to sell a privately held company. And the middle of each decade in the last 4, including this one, has been a wonderful time to sell your business. At the end of each decade, we go into a recession or near recession, and then we're climbing out of the recession, near recession in the beginning of the decade. Now, nobody knows if history will repeat itself this decade, at the end of the decade, because we're only in 2018. But so far, it's still a really good time to sell your business. So you have to understand, you can't necessarily pick an age at which you want to retire. And this is a really important point. You can't just pick an age. You have to understand what's going on in the general market and whether or not it makes sense, and it's a good time to sell. 9, minimize taxes. Is there anybody out there who doesn't want to minimize taxes? I don't think so, or there may be just a few folks. But most owners have worked their entire lives, and they're paying. Some owners are paying really high taxes on the profits of their business. So, if you can minimize taxes not only on the income that you're generating from your business, but also on the business transfer, by planning in advance, a lot of owners would want to do that, right? So planning in advance gives you time to make changes so that you can minimize those taxes. There's lots that can be done to do that. Okay, and find peace of mind, right? Find peace of mind. I was speaking to an owner just the other day. Actually, he was a new owner. He bought into a company of one of my clients. It was somebody that my client had known in the industry for over 30 years. And they finally became co-owners just a few months ago. And he said, the number one thing that going through this process did was allow me to find peace of mind, and it took the stress out of the process for me. So, as owners, if you're looking to sell your business to other folks, there's a lot of things that you're worried about. So this planning in advance will allow you to address those concerns and challenges and issues up front, and allow you to have peace of mind as you go through the process. So, and that's worth a lot. We're trying to get owners, we're trying to allow owners to have less stress in their lives, not more, right? You already have enough stress by running the business. So by planning in advance, if you can reduce that stress and know that you're on the right track. I don't know many owners who would say, I don't want to do that. It doesn't make sense. So strategies chosen and why. So let's talk about that. And this, by the way, I was listening to a speaker not long ago who was talking about the statistics nationwide. So this is not just in my client base, but nationwide, these stats are pretty darn close. Don't hold me exactly to these numbers, but it's pretty darn close that about 1/3 of businesses sell externally or want to sell externally. And I say want because not every business that tries to sell externally can sell. And about 2/3 want to do internal transfers. So let's talk about, again, some of the pros and cons, or summarize some of the pros and cons of each one of these, because I talked pretty quickly about them when we were looking at Follow the Yellow Brick Road. So the pros of an outside sale. It might get you the highest gross selling price. Not always, but it might. The owner can typically step away sooner. So if you sell your business to an outside buyer, most owners will want to step away sooner, and most buyers will want the owners to step away sooner. They don't want owners to stay around, right? And they don't want employees confused about who they're taking orders from. The one exception to that, by the way, is a private equity group. A private equity group wants the owners, or at least some of the managers, to stick around and have ownership so that they have a vested interest in running the company, and they can get what we call a second bite of the apple when the business is sold 5 years later. But owners can choose to step away sooner generally for an external sale. Money up front. Yeah, it's not easy to get money up front with an internal transfer, right? Unless there's some capital. You can go to a bank. You can ask managers to put in some capital. But your chances are you're going to get more capital up front with an outside deal. You may or may not get the highest gross selling price, but you'll typically get more up front. Cons on an external sale. It typically disrupts the business, right? Not always, but there's always some disruption, I guess. It's not always detrimental or disastrous, thankfully, but there is some disruption. It's new owners. How could that not disrupt the business? There's no guarantee that the employees will be kept, and this is one that many owners just can't. It just bothers them that there's no guarantee. You can sometimes get a buyer to say that they will keep certain employees, but maybe not all. The highest taxes. Usually it's the highest taxes are paid because, guess what? The buyer wants to pay the minimum amount of taxes as well. They want to maximize their tax break after they own the business, right? So they want, sometimes they want the seller to pay the highest taxes so they can be in a better tax position when they own the company. So it's a wrestle between the buyer and the seller on the taxes. So generally, you're going to pay the higher taxes in an external sale than you would in an internal. It's hard to find a buyer and consummate a deal. It is darn hard to find a buyer and consummate a deal, I'll tell you. Unless you have this business that is just so highly desirable that everybody wants it, which is pretty darn rare. It can be really hard to find a buyer. And then, even when you find a buyer, going through the deal process, sometimes they close and sometimes they don't. And you won't know until the ink is dry. You will not know it's really going to close until the ink is dry and the funds are transferred into your account. So it's a stressful process, and there's no guarantees it's going to go through. So it's tricky. It's tricky. An internal sale, pros, you can minimize the taxes more easily. Owners can stay and keep control longer and participate in value growth, minimize business disruption, right? Because the successors know the business. So generally, there's less disruption. The cons to an external sale, you might not get the highest value, maybe. Generally, you have to use business profits to buy out the seller. So that's always an interesting one for owners. They're saying, now, wait a minute, you want me to use my own profits to buy myself out? And the answer is, it's the business profits that really fund most buyouts, right? If there's no business profits, any buyer is not going to get a return on their investment, right? But in this case, they're funding the actual seller. So yes, but if you've transitioned out of the company, are they really your profits anymore, or are they the profits of the management team who are running the business? So there's a lot of different ways to look at it, but a lot of times on these internal transfers, we are using to some degree the business profits to buy out the seller. The buyout could take more time than an external sale. And that's generally true, but that can actually be a good thing because a lot of owners are not ready to leave. They're not ready to leave, so they want it to take some time for the transfer. Okay, let's talk about the lessons learned. We only have a couple more minutes, and we're going to open it up for Q&A here. But I want to cover these because they're so important. Lessons learned by owners. Please start early. These things take time, internal as well as external sales. And that surprises people. But, as I mentioned, a lot of owners don't want to leave, but just grooming people to take over can take years. Getting the owner, the selling owner, enough money out of the profits can take years. So these internal can take time. External does as well because you've got so much preparation for an external sale. And it can take 9 to 12 months to close a deal. And I mean it, 9 to 12 months just to close a deal. Maximizing business value. It's not done overnight. There's a lot of things you can do, but they take time to kick in and to really drive profits. Grooming successors, we talked about. Tax planning, we talked about. Accumulating assets outside the business. Please, as an owner, I beg you to save more money outside your business, and so you won't be as highly dependent on the proceeds. We are going to have another recession. The question is when. And the question is, what impact will that recession have in your business? If you've saved outside the business, you're going to be much less dependent on the proceeds. Remove the dependence on the owner. Get rid of the dependence off of you, right? We don't want the business dependent on you. Buyers will look at that and say that they can never buy the company because the business is so dependent on you. You've got to hire other people. Owners should never step away and lose touch with the business performance. In a very early case that I worked on, the mom and dad stepped away so far from the business that they had no idea that the kids were basically running it into the ground. A terrible situation. By the time I came in there, the parents didn't know it, but they were headed for the wall. And it was just, they had stepped way too far away. They lost touch with what was going on at the company. All owners must have a contingency plan. Oops, I said it one more time. But it's so critical. We can't make light of it. It's essential that you have that plan. Even if it's a letter written down, something. Start the conversation as soon as kids enter the business and have it regularly. How many times have you heard about a family business where you thought the kids wanted to take over, but they really didn't want the business? Never sign tax returns or legal documents you do not understand. Essential. Always seek independent and objective advice. Independent and objective means your advisors have no agenda. They have no agenda. Never sell your business without an intermediary. Unless you've done it multiple times before, do not attempt it alone. You will leave money on the table. Take immediate action when profits wane. Immediate action, right? So during that last recession, people waited far too long to right size. Do not, and it's always tricky. You let good people go, it's hard to find them. So it's always tricky, but take immediate action of some kind when profits wane. Continue to grow the business no matter which strategy is chosen. You've got to grow the business no matter which strategy is chosen. A growing, profitable business is the ticket to success for ownership transfers. Whether you're doing internal or external, you must have business profits. Upgrade your advisors as your business grows. Too many times I've seen owners who have, they wanted, real estate attorneys to do their business sale, or they were working with a CPA that was far less sophisticated than they needed for the size of their business. So we've seen that happen as well. And just know that we are here to assist you. We've got tools and resources on the website. We've got the book. I do free 30-minute consultations. And there are clients who sometimes engage us to help with their own customized plans. We typically work with companies on the larger size that are north of about $5 million in revenue. And that's it. So Laura Lee, I'm a few minutes over, but would we like to open it up for Q&A?
Hi, Jane. Yes, thank you so much. We would like to open it up to Q&A now. We have a question from John Graham, and he asks, what is the scale of the wealth gap? Net worth is a fixed static item, but retirement need is presumably a dynamic value. How does the wealth gap combine a static with a dynamic value? So that's what he wants to know.
Okay, I think I understand the question. I hope I do. I think what it's saying is that your wealth gap is changing over time, right? So I think that's the gist of the question. So as owners, so what the wealth gap does, and yes, it is measuring a point in time. However, when that calculation is done, it's based on what the owner envisions their post-transition lifestyle will be, right? So how much money they think they're going to need post-transition, what they have today, and how much those assets will grow, right? So if you have, say, $1 million in your portfolio today, if it grows by 3%, 4%, 5% over the next 5 years, say, before you transition, how much will it be worth in 5 years, right? So we're looking at your rates of return, right? You're looking at your life expectancy. How long are you going to live, and how many more years do you have to fund that lifestyle? And then when do you want to transfer out of the business, right? So is it 5 more years that you'll be earning your salary and bonus, and you'll be able to save another, call it $20,000 a year? So you've got to input all those different factors. And yes, it is a guess, but it's also based on these projections based on future assumptions. It's assumptions that you're making about the future. So I hope I've addressed the question. Precious.
Yes, very good. I also want to know, how does debt figure into the business value calculation?
Sure. Okay, that's a really good question, actually. So if you sell your business externally, buyers always assume that sellers are responsible for the debt. Sellers are responsible for the debt, right? So if somebody buys your business, so they are not going to reduce the value in their mind of what they're paying for your business unless you expect them to pay for the debt, right? And then they would reduce the value of your company. But the other thing to think about is if you're doing an internal transfer, it could be handled differently in different ways. So, for example, I have a co-ownership situation right now that I'm working with, and there are one owner is transitioning out, and there are 4 owners. And for their purpose, they're valuing the company. They are subtracting the debt from the value of the company. because they want that owner who's leaving to still be responsible to buy out the previous owner who left. So there was debt that on the books to buy out the fifth owner who left a couple of years ago, and the owners. So the fourth owner who's walking out the door now, they want him to also be responsible to pay off that previous owner. So they subtracted the debt from the value of the company. But typically it's not subtracted. The old rule of thumb is if you're a seller for an external sale, that you keep the cash, but you also keep the debt. So you keep the cash, but you also keep the debt. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yes, thank you very much. Alan Rogers is interested in knowing how much your services cost. So.
Yeah. Okay. And that's a good question, Alan. So the way, every situation is different, Alan. I think it was Alan that asked the question. Every situation is different, Alan. So I'd be happy to chat with you about your situation. We typically do a fixed fee engagement to work with owners to help them develop a business ownership transition plan. But it's based on really the complexity of the situation, the number of shareholders, the size of the company. Sometimes there's multiple entities. There's multiple co-owners, multiple people who want to transition. So I'd be happy to have a discussion if you would like to email me after the presentation to set up a time. Happy to do that.
Yeah. We have one more question, and I just wanted to know, how large does a company have to be a candidate for the ESOP?
Oh, okay. For the ESOP. Okay, how large? Yes. And actually, we talked a little bit about that during the presentation, but yes, there's a minimum that you have to be. Legally, you have to have at least 15 or 20 employees.
Okay.
Realistically, you need at least $3 million in business value and $500,000 a year in free cash flow. If you don't have $500,000 a year in free cash flow, it wouldn't be worth your time. And I'll tell you what the danger is. If the business, for example, if you hit a recession and the profits go down and you don't have enough money to fund the ESOP, then you might have to unwind it, which can be very costly expense. So that's about the minimum size.
Thank you. We have another question. Sorry, I said that would be the final question. But Gil Young asks, so if you have debt from equipment or vehicle loans that the seller would pay off those loans. Wait, sorry.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
So yes, and I'm sorry when I talked about debt a moment ago, I wasn't talking about like equipment loans. If you are selling equipment with your business that also has debt on that equipment, typically the buyer will assume those loans, right? So they don't usually buy the assets and then say you've got to continue to pay the leases on those assets or the loans. So the buyer does typically assume that kind of debt, right? But when they value your company, as we talked about business valuation, they're looking at how much cash flow does this business put out, right? It's almost always based on cash flow. It's also to some degree based on revenue as well, but not entirely. It's very important that it's based, it's almost always based on cash flow, or to a large degree. So they're looking at both. But yes, if they're buying assets that are needed to produce that revenue and profit, they'll typically assume the debt, right? And they take into account the fair market value of the assets that they're buying. So, but here's what you have to understand. In most industries, you cannot simply add the fair market value of your equipment, add that to the business value calculated based on cash flows. And what I mean is I had a landscaping contractor, a large landscaping contractor, who said to me, why isn't the value of my equipment being added into the value of my business, on top of the value of my business? And the reason is because that equipment is necessary to produce the revenue in the first place and the profits. So you don't add it in if it's needed to produce the revenue and profits. Now, exceptions to that, to things that are added in, would be inventory. So in some industries, inventory would be added in addition to the business value based on cash flow. And also, of course, real estate that might be sold with the business. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jane. Last call for questions. If you guys have any questions, please send them in. Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you again. Thank you so much for the presentation. As a last reminder, we will have the recording on iConnect at the end of the day. So please check there. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Precious. I appreciate it.
Thank you. That's it. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.